My name is Grace Townsend. I'm 26 years old. And last Christmas Eve, my grandfather sat at my father's beautifully decorated dinner table, carved a slice of turkey, looked me dead in the eye across the candlelight, and casually asked, "So Gracie, did you ever fix up that back porch? That house had good bones, but the porch needed work." I remember blinking at him. Then I remember setting my fork down, because I had no idea what house he was talking about. And in the silence that followed, 9 people sat frozen around that table like someone had cut the power to the room. My father stopped breathing. My stepmother nearly dropped the gravy boat. My teenage half-sister went completely still. And my grandfather, my calm, steady, 74-year-old grandfather, slowly turned his head toward my father and asked the question that blew my family apart. "Richard, where is Grace's house?" That was the moment I learned 3 things. First, I had been lied to for years. Second, a house had been given to me and stolen before I even knew it existed. And third, the people I had spent my whole life trying not to disappoint had built their happiness on money that was supposed to be mine. And that wasn't even the worst part, because before dinner was over, we found the photographs. And the photographs proved they hadn't just stolen my future. They had been trying to erase me from the family, while pretending I'd been there all along. If you've ever sat at a table and suddenly realized the people around you weren't who you thought they were, stay with me. Because what happened that Christmas didn't begin with a house. It began 18 years earlier, on the day my mother died. Before I take you back, if you enjoy real-life betrayal stories, family secrets, and emotional long-form storytelling, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Now let me take you back to a rainy Tuesday in March, the day my mother stopped breathing, and my father started disappearing. My mother died on a Tuesday in March, and it rained for 6 days straight. Not drizzle, not soft spring rain. I mean the kind of relentless gray weather that soaks into the ground, into the walls, into your bones, until the whole world feels like it's grieving with you. Her name was Ellen Hartley before she became Ellen Townsend. She taught 3rd grade at Meadowbrook Elementary. She had this laugh that somehow reached every room in a house before she did. You could hear it from the hallway, from the kitchen, from the backyard if the window was open. It was the kind of laugh that made a home feel occupied even when nobody was speaking. Every Sunday, she'd pull out a wooden recipe box from the kitchen shelf. It was oak, worn smooth at the corners from years of being opened and closed. Inside were index cards in her handwriting: tomato sauce, chicken soup, apple pie, pot roast. And she always let me choose. I always picked the tomato sauce. And every single time she'd smile and act surprised like I hadn't made the same decision for 6 months straight. I was 8 years old when cancer took her. Lung cancer. Stage 4 by the time the doctors found it. She had never smoked a cigarette in her life. Not one. I remember the doctor using the word unlucky with a straight face, as if luck were a sufficient explanation for a child losing her mother before 4th grade. As if a single word could make that make sense. After the funeral, my father changed. Not all at once. Not dramatically. He didn't become violent. He didn't become cruel. He just receded. Like the tide pulling out farther and farther each day until one morning, you realize the shore has been left empty. At first, he stayed later at the auto shop. Then later still. Then at some point, I stopped asking where he'd been. I'd hear his truck in the driveway around 11. Sometimes midnight. I'd hear the fridge open. Then the sound of him standing there in the cold blue kitchen light for a while. Not eating, not moving, just existing inside some silence I couldn't reach. Then the fridge would close, and he would go to bed, and that was our life. For a while, it was just the 2 of us in a house that still sounded like my mother if you listened hard enough. Her mugs in the cabinet, her cardigan on the back of a chair, her handwriting on recipes, her photograph in the hallway. But grief doesn't always shatter things. Sometimes it empties them out. And when a house has been emptied out long enough, somebody always comes along and decides they can rearrange it. If my father disappeared emotionally after my mother died, my grandfather stepped in like a retaining wall when the ground starts to shift. His name was Will Hartley, my mother's father. He had spent 40 years as a general contractor and could build almost anything with his hands. Decks, porches, cabinets, whole additions. If you drove through our county, half the houses had a piece of him in them somewhere. A staircase he'd built, a porch he'd repaired, a kitchen he'd framed. He had hands like sandpaper and a voice that was calm enough to make you believe broken things could still be fixed. Every Friday afternoon, his old blue pickup would pull into our driveway, and I'd grab my backpack, a change of clothes, and whatever version of myself I had left that week. His house smelled like coffee, sawdust, old books, and the kind of honesty that only lives in places where nobody is pretending to be better than they are. At Grandpa Will's house, I wasn't a burden. I wasn't an afterthought. I wasn't the reminder of something painful. I was just Grace, his granddaughter. And on those weekends, he taught me everything. How to change a faucet washer, how to regrout tile, how to patch drywall, how to use a level, how to hold a flashlight properly. how to tell the difference between a cheap repair and a real one. He used to say, "Anybody can cover a problem, not everybody can fix what's underneath." At the time, I thought he was talking about houses. Years later, I realized he was talking about people too. He told me stories about my mother when she was my age, how she used to show up at his job sites with lemonade in mason jars, how she was always bringing home stray animals and then arguing persuasively until somebody agreed to keep them, how she never asked permission to be strong. One late summer evening, we sat on his porch while thunder rolled over the fields in the distance. I remember the air smelled like rain and cut grass. He rested one rough hand on my shoulder and said very quietly, "I'll make sure you're taken care of, Gracie. That's a promise." I was 9. I didn't understand what he meant. I thought it was one of those adult sentences children are meant to accept without asking questions. I had no idea that promise would become the center of the biggest betrayal of my life. Pamela Fletcher entered our lives the way a season changes. So slowly at first you barely notice. Until one day, everything looks different, and you can't remember exactly when it happened. My father introduced her to me 2 years after my mother died. I was 10. Pamela had auburn hair, a polished smile, and a gift for listening in a way that made people feel chosen. She tilted her head when you spoke. She asked follow-up questions. She brought a stuffed bear the first time she came over for dinner. She made pot roast. She reorganized the hall closet. And for about 6 months, I truly believed she cared about me. That's the thing about certain kinds of people. They don't enter a room by force. They enter by becoming useful, by becoming pleasant, by becoming difficult to object to. Then the small rearrangements started. My bedroom, the one next to my father's room, became the guest room. Pamela said it was temporary. Just until we sort out the nursery, she told me, resting a hand on her stomach. She was pregnant. I moved down the hall, and I never moved back. Then the photographs changed. The framed photos of my mother began disappearing one at a time, first from the kitchen, then from the living room, then from the stairway. In their place came newer, brighter pictures. My father and Pamela at the beach, my father and Pamela at a restaurant, my father and Pamela holding tiny baby shoes toward the camera. It was subtle enough that nobody from outside the house would have noticed, but I noticed. When you're a child in a house where love has started shifting away from you, you notice every inch. Pamela was never cruel in ways you could easily explain to someone else. That's what made it so difficult. She didn't scream. She didn't insult me. She didn't do anything dramatic enough to be called abusive. She was simply warm when there was an audience, and cool when there wasn't. She knew how to perform affection in public. She knew exactly how kind to sound when my grandfather was nearby. But in private, she made me feel like borrowed furniture, something still in the house, but no longer part of the design. She'd ask what Bridget wanted for dinner, and then serve whatever Bridget chose without once looking at me. She'd plan outings and mention them the next day, casually, as if I must have forgotten I wasn't invited. She'd say things like, "Oh, I thought you were working," or "You seemed busy," with that smooth, polished tone that made exclusion sound like consideration. And my father? He didn't stop her. He didn't defend me. He didn't openly join in either. He just stood in that narrow, cowardly place between conflict and conscience and chose whichever option required the least courage. Every time. And after a few years, you stop expecting rescue from people who keep watching you drown. My half-sister, Bridget Renee Townsend, was born in January, 7 pounds, 4 ounces. And the day she arrived, my father became a completely different man. Suddenly he was present, attentive, proud, tender. He carried her everywhere, took pictures constantly, posted them online with captions like, "My whole world." And when you're 12 years old and your father publicly calls a newborn his whole world, you do the math without anyone having to explain it. It means there's no room left for you in the sentence. Bridget got the biggest bedroom. I got moved to the finished basement. Finished was generous. It had one small window near the ceiling, a bare bulb overhead, and the steady hum of the water heater through the drywall. Pamela smiled and said, "It has its own bathroom. You'll love the privacy." I was 12. I didn't want privacy. I wanted proof that I still belonged upstairs. But nobody asked what I wanted. That became a pattern too. Bridget got ballet lessons at 4, soccer at 5, piano at 6, new uniforms, new shoes, new applause. My father and Pamela never missed a recital, a game, a performance. They sat in front rows. They clapped. They recorded everything. They became the kind of parents people praise. And nobody asked if there was another child in the family who maybe wanted to be seen too. Eventually, I stopped waiting. I got used to being the person who cleaned up after events I wasn't included in, the one who stacked plates after birthday parties, the one who rinsed pans after dinners where nobody asked how school was, the one who learned early that being low maintenance is often just another name for being neglected successfully. The only only person who never made me feel separate from Bridget was Grandpa Will. Every month, like clockwork, he showed up with 2 gifts. Same paper, same ribbon, same care. One for me, one for Bridget. He spoke to us like we were equally real, equally his, equally family. And that mattered more than I can explain. Because when everybody else is quietly ranking your value, the person who refuses to participate becomes unforgettable. One Thanksgiving, Pamela spent almost 20 minutes forcing the family to watch a video of Bridget's piano recital on her phone. Everyone smiled. Everyone praised. I stood at the sink washing dishes nobody had asked me to wash. Grandpa Will came up beside me and asked softly, "You doing all right, Gracie?" I said what children and lonely people always say. "I'm fine." He studied me the way he used to study a cracked wall before deciding how serious the damage really was. Then he gave me a small wink and said, "Just wait, good things take time." Later that night, when the house had quieted and the cold had settled in around the porch, he pulled me aside and lowered his voice. "When you turn 21, he said, I have something for you. Something your mother wanted you to have." "What is it?" "Patience, kiddo." Then he squeezed my hand. I didn't press, but that sentence stayed with me for years, like a stone in my pocket, small enough to ignore, heavy enough to always feel. By 16, I had 2 jobs, 1 bus pass, and a growing suspicion that invisibility and safety were not the same thing. I worked mornings at a coffee shop before school, weekends at a dry cleaner folding clothes that smelled like other people's detergent and perfume. I bought my own books, packed my own lunches, took the 7:15 bus because nobody offered me rides, and after a while, I stopped asking. Meanwhile, my father went all in on a dream. He used what little savings he had and opened an auto repair business called Townsend Motor Works on Route 9. He talked about it like it was a second chance. New lifts, a paint booth, his name on the sign in red lettering. Pamela encouraged him loudly, the way she always supported anything that might produce a bigger, shinier future for her side of the house. She talked about growth, about the next chapter, about expansion. What she didn't talk about were the unpaid invoices in the kitchen drawer or the late-night fights behind their bedroom door. I heard them through the ceiling from the basement. Not the exact words, just the rhythm, sharp, fast, circular. 2 people arguing not because they disagreed about reality, but because reality had already started collapsing, and they were trying to decide whose fault it would be. I graduated high school on a Friday in June. Grandpa Will was in the front row, 40 minutes early, wearing his good button-down shirt and clapping like I had just won something international. My father showed up late, stood in the back, left before the reception. Pamela didn't come at all. She said Bridget had a stomach bug. I never bothered confirming it. I enrolled in community college that fall, business administration, because practical choices felt safer than hopeful ones. I still lived at home, but Pamela made sure I understood my place. "You're an adult now," she said one morning, sliding a sticky note across the counter. It had a number on it, my share of groceries. I stared at it. Then I paid it every month without arguing. Because once people make it clear that your belonging is conditional, you start paying for your own existence just to avoid hearing the price out loud. Then the business failed. Townsend Motor Works lasted less than 2 years. I didn't know the exact numbers then, but I learned them later. The debt was crushing. About $180,000 spread across the bank, vendors, rent, and promises made on confidence instead of math. My father took a job managing a used car lot, and one night, through the walls, I heard him tell someone on the phone, "We'll figure it out." What I didn't know at the time was that "we" meant everyone but me, and "figure it out" meant something much uglier. I moved into my studio apartment at 22, and for the first time in my life, silence felt chosen. The place was tiny, 300 square feet of carpet, drywall, and determination. The kitchen was barely bigger than a closet. The bathroom fan sounded like it was trying to take off. The radiator knocked at night, but it was mine. No one could move me downstairs. No one could replace photos in my house. No one could make me feel decorative. I had finished my degree, found an office coordinator job at a small insurance firm, 40 hours a week, decent health insurance, enough to pay $950 a month in rent if I kept the thermostat low, skipped takeout, and pretended generic cereal was a lifestyle choice. I loved that apartment with the devotion people usually reserve for first love, because it was proof that I could survive without being chosen. The sad part was how quickly my family adjusted to my absence. My father called maybe 4 times the first year. Short calls, 90 seconds, maybe 2 minutes. The kind of calls people make when they want credit for contact without the inconvenience of emotional involvement. He never asked about my work in detail, never asked if I was lonely, never asked what I was building. He asked, "You doing okay?" But in a hallway voice, a moving voice, a voice that had already started leaving before the answer arrived. What hurt more was Grandpa Will. I called him, again and again. The number I had always went to voicemail, a generic one, no name, no warning. warmth. I left messages anyway. Hey, Grandpa, just wanted to hear your voice. Hi, it's me again. Call me when you can. No response. I asked my father what was going on. He said Grandpa had gone to Florida. Arthritis, physical therapy, warm weather. He's fine, resting. Don't worry. I believed him, because if I didn't believe him, I had to face the possibility that the one person who had always stayed had now decided to stop, and I wasn't ready for that. So I made excuses for Grandpa. He's old, he's tired, he forgets. He'll call eventually. He never did, not because he didn't want to, but because someone had made sure he couldn't. What I wouldn't learn until 2 years later was this. Pamela had told Grandpa Will I'd changed my number. She gave him a fake one, a dead one, a number that reached nobody. And when he asked my father about me, my father told him I was busy, happy, thriving, and not interested in being bothered. Meanwhile, during those same 2 years, my grandfather did something extraordinary, something he had promised my mother long before she died. He transferred a house to my father for me. And not just a house, a savings fund too, $400,000. The house was on Birchwood Lane, a 3-bedroom colonial that had belonged to my great-grandmother once upon a time. A family house. Old, solid, structurally sound. The kind of place you can build a real life in if somebody gives you the chance. Grandpa Will transferred both the deed and the money to my father with one clear instruction. Give this to Grace. My father signed the papers. He said he would. He emailed Grandpa to confirm it was done. He lied. And while I struggled in a studio apartment, eating ramen, skipping lunch, and stretching every paycheck to the dollar, they spent it. My house, my money, my future. Spent before I even knew it existed. The first hint that something was wrong came on my 24th birthday. Actually, 3 months after my 24th birthday. A card showed up, forwarded twice. Inside, in Grandpa Will's familiar handwriting, it said, "I hope you love the new place, Gracie." That was it. No explanation, no detail, just that sentence. I read it twice, then a third time. And because I had already spent years training myself to explain away pain, I decided he must be confused. Maybe his memory was slipping. Maybe he meant something else. Maybe older people get mixed up sometimes. I pinned the card to my fridge with a sunflower magnet and went to bed. I had no idea I had just taped evidence to my refrigerator. The email arrived on December 19th. 14 words from Pamela. Christmas Eve dinner at our place. 6 o'clock. Bring nothing. It wouldn't feel like Christmas without you. I stared at the screen for a long time. Pamela's messages always felt like they were written for an audience, even when nobody else was copied. Everything about her tone had that polished sweetness that only ever appeared when appearances mattered. I almost ignored it. I almost deleted it. Then I saw the second line she added below. Grandpa Will confirmed he's coming too. That changed everything. I called Aunt Carolyn immediately. Carolyn was my mother's younger sister, the kind of aunt who actually notices when your smile is fake. She picked up on the second ring. When I asked if Grandpa was really back from Florida, she went quiet. Then she said, "Grace, he's been asking about you every week." My stomach turned. What? Every week? He keeps calling Richard and Pamela asking why you won't return his calls. They've been telling him you're busy. I sat down so fast the mattress creaked. Every week, for 2 years, he had been looking for me, and I had been looking for him, which meant somebody had built that wall between us brick by brick, and then stood there smiling while we both blamed ourselves. Carolyn said, "Go. Whatever's happening in that house, your grandfather needs to see your face." Hope is a terrible negotiator. It accepts almost any terms. So I wrote Pamela back, "I'll be there." And that one decision changed everything. The night before Christmas Eve, I stood in front of the bathroom mirror in my apartment trying to decide what to wear. I didn't own anything impressive, but I did own one thing that mattered. A cream cable-knit sweater my mother had made by hand the winter before she got sick. The hem was slightly uneven where she'd miscounted stitches. Inside the collar, she had embroidered a tiny E for Ellen. I kept it folded in cedar paper through every move, every closet purge, every season. I slipped it on. It still smelled faintly of cedar and memory. I told myself I was going for Grandpa. That was true. What I didn't understand yet was why Pamela had invited me at all. I thought maybe she was trying, in her own strange way, to make peace. I thought maybe Christmas had softened something. I was wrong. Pamela hadn't invited me because she wanted me there. She invited me because my grandfather was watching. And a performance only works if the cast looks complete. When I pulled into the driveway at 10 minutes to 6, the first thing I noticed was the SUV, pearl white, new, current model, parked beside my father's truck like it belonged to a completely different financial reality. The second thing I noticed was the house itself. because the house I grew up in was gone. The structure was the same, technically, but the details had changed. New siding, new windows, expanded garage, fresh trim, and the front porch, the old porch that used to sag slightly to the left and made my mother joke that it stayed upright out of pure spite, had been fully rebuilt. New posts, new railings, fresh stain. It looked expensive. Inside, it looked worse. Granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, a new sectional in the living room, a mounted flat screen above the fireplace, a Christmas tree so symmetrical and coordinated it looked professionally styled, gold ribbon, white lights, matching ornaments that looked like they came in boxed sets. I stood in the kitchen pretending to admire it all while one thought kept circling. How? My father managed a used car lot. Pamela worked part-time at a dentist's office. The repair shop had failed years earlier in a mountain of debt. So how exactly were they living like this? Pamela answered the door with a hug that lasted just a little too long. Grace, sweetheart, you look wonderful. She smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, the exact scent my mother used to light on Christmas Eve. That detail hit me like a slap. Not because candle scents can belong to only one person, but because people like Pamela don't accidentally borrow the atmosphere of the woman they replaced. They do it because they want the room to forget who owned it first. Bridget was on the couch scrolling through her phone with earbuds in. She looked up long enough to say, "Hey," then looked down again. She was 14 now, tall, stylish, expensive sweater, perfect posture, the kind of teenager raised with the confidence that comes from never once questioning whether the room was built for you. Then I saw the bookshelf. 3 framed family photos sat on the second shelf. All of them included me, and all of them made my skin crawl. There I was at a barbecue. There I was at a lake. There I was with Pamela at one of Bridget's birthdays. The problem? I didn't remember those moments at all. The photos looked normal from a distance, but my face in each one had that strange, slightly wrong quality that you can't explain immediately, like a window that almost fits the frame but doesn't quite sit flush. Before I could stare too long, I noticed something else on top of the kitchen cabinet, half hidden behind napkins. A wooden box, oak, worn smooth at the corners. My breath caught. My mother's recipe box. I knew it instantly. Pamela saw me looking, and with a movement so casual it was almost elegant, she draped a dish towel over it and smiled. "Can I get you something to drink?" That was the moment I knew 2 things. First, she had things in that house that did not belong to her. And second, whatever story they were telling was already cracking at the edges. Pamela had set the table for 9, but somehow managed to arrange it in a way that still told me exactly where I ranked. I was seated at the far end, half against the wall, between an empty chair and the sideboard. Aunt Carolyn arrived next, took one look at the setup, and without saying a word, dragged her chair to my side. That small act almost made me emotional on the spot. Uncle Dennis came in after her with that quiet, grounded energy some men have, the kind that says they don't waste words because they don't need to. Then came 2 family friends, Ed Purcell and his wife Dana. Ed ran a body shop near the old dealership and had known my father for years. Everyone settled in. My father sat at the head of the table looking older than I remembered, grayer at the temples, hollower in the cheeks. He hugged me briefly and said, "Glad you came," then devoted far more attention to opening wine than to speaking to me. Pamela floated through the room refilling glasses, adjusting dishes, narrating Bridget's accomplishments as if she were hosting a press conference for a minor royal. Honor roll, boarding school application. Piano teacher says she has real promise. Every topic curved naturally back toward Bridget. Then, because public balance mattered, Pamela turned to me with a smile. "And Grace, how's the insurance office?" "Fine," I said. "That's wonderful." And she moved on before I could breathe. It was the perfect Pamela question. Not a question asked to know. A question asked to be seen asking. Carolyn leaned toward me later and whispered, "How's my girl really?" That tiny extra word, really, nearly cracked me open. Because some people ask how you are as punctuation, and some people ask because they're ready to hear the truth. "I'm okay," I whispered. "Better now." She squeezed my hand under the table. Across from us, Bridget glanced up and said, "Dad said you still rent." Then she added, with complete teenage sincerity and catastrophic timing, "That's so brave." The whole table flinched. Pamela murmured, "Bridget," in that fake, gentle tone mothers use when they want to look like they're correcting a child without actually correcting them. I let it go. Bridget was a teenager raised on the altitude of other people's money. She didn't know the air was thin up there. Then the doorbell rang, and everything changed. Part 11. Grandpa walks in. It was 7:42. I remember because I checked the clock automatically when the bell rang. Pamela's face tightened for half a second, just around the jaw, gone almost instantly. But I saw it. And once you notice fear on someone who usually controls every room they enter, it's hard to forget. My grandfather walked in carrying 2 things, a bag of Christmas gifts in one hand and a leather briefcase in the other. The gifts were expected. The briefcase was not. He looked thinner than the last time I had had seen him. His hair had gone fully silver. He moved slower, but his eyes were the same, sharp, steady. The eyes of a man who had spent decades measuring twice before cutting once. He saw me and stopped. "Gracie," that was all he said. I stood so fast my chair scraped the floor. He crossed the room and wrapped me in both arms. I pressed my face into his shoulder and smelled sawdust, cedar, aftershave, and everything safe I thought I'd lost. He pulled back, held me at arm's length, and his eyes glistened. "You look just like her." I couldn't speak. For 2 years I had thought he'd forgotten me. For 2 years he had thought I had chosen silence. And in that one embrace, both lies died. He greeted everyone else with brief efficiency. A nod for Carolyn, a handshake for Dennis, a measured hello to Ed and Dana, a polite acknowledgement of Pamela that contained no warmth whatsoever. And then one long look at my father. Not dramatic, not loud, just a look that said there was unfinished business in the room. He sat beside me, placed the briefcase on the floor within reach, and while Pamela hurried to bring another setting, he leaned close and whispered, "I've been trying to call you for months. The number your father gave me never worked." My stomach dropped. I never changed my number. His jaw tightened once. Not surprise, confirmation. Then he took my hand under the table. His palm was rough and warm, but for the first time in my life, I felt his fingers tremble. That's when I understood. He didn't bring the briefcase because he suspected something. He brought it because he had already started building the case. The question came between the turkey and the cranberry sauce. That's how ordinary the moment looked from the outside. We were halfway through dinner, silverware clinking, wine being poured, Pamela floating around in hostess mode, Bridget talking about school, my father on his third glass of wine, which was unusual enough that I noticed. Then Grandpa Will cut a piece of turkey, chewed, set down his knife, looked at me with the same easy warmth he always used, and said, "So Gracie, did you ever fix up that back porch? That house had good bones, but the porch needed work when I signed it over." I stared at him. My fork stopped halfway to my plate. "What house, Grandpa?" And the whole room died. There are silences that feel empty. This was not that kind. This silence had weight. You could hear candlewick burning. You could hear someone's breath catch. You could hear the soft ceramic click as Pamela failed to set the gravy boat down properly. Grandpa leaned forward slightly. "The house on Birchwood Lane, Grace. I signed the deed over to your father 2 years ago for you." No one spoke. He continued, "Along with the savings account, $400,000. Aunt Carolyn inhaled sharply. Dennis set his fork down. Bridget stopped moving. I turned to my father. "I never got a house." He didn't answer. "I never got money." Still nothing. My grandfather turned slowly toward him. "Richard," my father swallowed. "Dad, there's been a misunderstanding." It was one of the weakest sentences I had ever heard a grown man say. Because misunderstandings do not involve deeds. Misunderstandings do not involve bank transfers. Misunderstandings do not stretch across 2 years and a fake phone number. Pamela jumped in quickly. "We didn't want to overwhelm her. She's so young, and taking on property at 24. My grandfather lifted one hand. Not high, not violently, just enough. And the room obeyed him instantly. "I signed those papers in April," he said, voice flat and precise. "I told you to give them to Grace that month. You told me you would." My father's lips parted, closed, opened again. No real words came out. Carolyn leaned forward. "What house, Richard?" Ed Purcell sat back, folded his arms, and said quietly, "Yeah, I'd love to hear this." Pamela dabbed at her eyes with a linen napkin. The napkin stayed dry. That's what I remember most about that moment. Not her expression, not her voice. The dry napkin. Because some people have practiced looking wounded for so long they forget grief leaves evidence. I looked around the room. The gold-rimmed china, the crystal glasses, the expensive wine, the polished kitchen, the renovated house, and suddenly every luxury around me started forming a shape. Not elegance, evidence. I looked back at my father and said, very clearly, "When were you going to tell me?" Neither of them had an answer, and that silence was answer enough. My grandfather opened the briefcase with the calm of a man who has never needed theatrics to win an argument. The brass clasps clicked. He removed a thick manila folder, tabs, copies, notes, chronological order, everything exactly where it should be. He laid it on the dining table between the mashed potatoes and cranberry sauce like he was placing a blueprint on a workbench. "Deed of transfer," he said, sliding forward the first page. "Signed by me, countersigned by Richard Townsend, dated April 23rd. He moved to the next document. "Bank wire confirmation. $400,000 from my account to yours, Richard. Memo line, for Grace Townsend, House and Transition Fund." Then he pulled out an email, printed, highlighted. He read it aloud. "Richard, just checking in. Did Grace get the house keys and account details? Want to make sure everything's settled." Then he lifted his eyes to my father. "Your reply, April 30th. All taken care of, Pop. She's thrilled." I have never in my life seen someone age that quickly. My father didn't look guilty anymore. He looked exposed. Pamela had gone still in a completely different way. not emotional, not shocked, calculating. Her mind was moving now, trying to figure out which version of the story might still save her. Ed stood first, his chair scraped back hard against the floor. "What the hell is this, Richard?" Dennis spoke next, much quieter. "This isn't family confusion. This is documentation." Carolyn turned to Pamela. "You knew?" Pamela didn't answer, but her silence entered the room like a confession. My grandfather closed the folder carefully. "I didn't come here to cause a scene," he said. "I came to give my granddaughter her Christmas, but now I need to understand something." He looked directly at my father. "Where did her house go?" My father confessed the way concrete cracks, slowly, under pressure, and never in a straight line. "The shop went under," he said first, as if that explained anything. "I owed money, as if debt created entitlement. The bank was going to take this house, as if saving one house justified stealing another." Pamela snapped. "Don't put this on me." He turned toward her. "You said we could use it temporarily. I said we needed time. You made the decision." My grandfather didn't look at either of them as husband and wife. He looked at them like two contractors arguing while standing inside a collapsed structure they had both touched. "Did you use the money, Richard?" My father closed his eyes, then nodded. "All of it?" Longer pause, then another nod. That was the moment the room exhaled, not because anyone was relieved, because denial had finally died. I heard my own voice ask the next question before I fully decided to speak. "The renovations?" Silence. "Bridget's school?" Silence. "The car outside?" Nothing. I looked around the room again. The new furniture? The holidays? The trips? My father stared at the tablecloth, and that was enough. That was my money, my inheritance, my life raft, my chance at stability, used to repair their image, used to buy Bridget opportunities, used to fund vacations I had never been invited to, used to create a polished, upscale version of family life that specifically excluded me. And the worst part? For 22 months, I had been budgeting groceries, skipping coffee, living in a tiny apartment, and wondering if my struggles were simply the cost of adulthood. Turns out I was not poor. I was robbed, and I didn't cry. Not then. I think that frightened them more than tears would have. Because anger can be argued with, sobs can be soothed, but the kind of stillness that comes when someone finally understands the scale of what was done to them, that kind of silence is final. If the money had been the theft, the photographs were the insult, maybe even the cruelty. My grandfather stood and walked into the living room. We all followed with our eyes. He picked up one of the framed photos from the bookshelf, the one at the lake. "Pamela sent me this last July," he said. "Said the whole family spent the weekend together." I shook my head slowly. I wasn't there. He brought the frame back to the table. Carolyn stood, took it from him, and held it under the chandelier. She studied it for maybe 5 seconds, then said, "The lighting is wrong." Everyone looked up. She turned it slightly. "Everyone else has light on the right side of their face. Grace has light on the left." Another photo came down, then another. Same problem. Small inconsistencies, shadow direction, edge softness, resolution differences around my shoulders and hairline. Then I saw one I recognized more clearly, a family barbecue photo. In it, I was wearing a blouse I had donated to Goodwill 3 years earlier. Even if the edit had been perfect, that detail alone destroyed it. Grandpa set the frame down carefully and said the sentence that made the room feel poisonous. "You fabricated evidence that my granddaughter was part of this family while spending her money." Nobody spoke. Bridget started crying. Real crying. Not performance, not strategy. The raw, ugly, bewildered crying of a 14-year-old learning in real time that the adults who built her world did it with stolen materials. "Mom?" she whispered. Pamela did not look at her. "Mom, is that true?" Still nothing. And some silences are louder than screaming. That was the moment Bridget learned what kind of mother she had, and maybe what kind of father too. Ed and Dana gathered their coats. Ed paused near the door, looked at my father and said, "Call me when you figure out what kind of man you want to be." Then they left. The room felt smaller with every truth. Smaller, hotter, closer, like the walls themselves were embarrassed. I stood up. My chair scraped loudly across the hardwood. Everyone looked at me. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't shout. I didn't throw anything. But something inside me had settled, like the final stone of a structure being lowered into place. "I'm not going to scream," I said, "and I'm not going to beg. I just need both of you to hear this." Nobody interrupted. I spent 2 years wondering what I did wrong, why Grandpa stopped calling, why I was working so hard just to stay afloat, why life always seemed harder for me than it should have been. I turned slowly, taking in the kitchen, the tree, the furniture. "Now I know, because while I was surviving, you were using my future to decorate your present." Pamela looked away. My father didn't move. Then I looked at Bridget. She was crying so hard she could barely hold herself together. "None of this is your fault," I told her. "Do you hear me? None of it." She nodded immediately, fast, desperately, like someone clinging to the only clean thing left in the room. Then I turned to my grandfather. "Can we go?" He was already reaching for the briefcase, already gathering the papers, already standing. He looked once at my father and said very evenly, "My attorney will contact you Monday." day. This is not over. Then he added with the same tone he once used to teach me carpentry. But tonight, I'm taking my granddaughter home. That sentence nearly broke me. Not because it was dramatic, because it was simple. Because for the first time in years, someone said I was theirs in a way that meant protection instead of ownership. I picked up my coat. I picked up my mother's sweater from the back of the chair, and I walked out of that house without looking back. Behind me, the Christmas tree still glowed. Perfect, expensive, silent, lighting a table nobody deserved to sit at. We drove for 12 minutes before either of us said a word. The snow handled the conversation for us. Grandpa's truck was still the same faded blue Ford F-150 he'd had for what felt like my whole life. The bench seat creaked, the heater rattled, the windshield wipers moved in that steady, hypnotic rhythm that makes grief feel louder somehow. I stared out the passenger window as neighborhoods slid by, lights in windows, inflatable Santas on lawns, families visible through curtains, people laughing over dinners that, for all I knew, were honest. Then Grandpa said quietly, still watching the road, "Your mother would have handled that exactly the same way." I laughed. It came out wet and broken and halfway to a sob. Then I started crying for real. Not because of the money, not because of the house, not even because of the betrayal itself. I cried because for 2 years I thought my grandfather had forgotten me, while he had spent those same 2 years trying to find me. "I called that number 40 times, he said. 40. I looked at him. He tightened his grip on the wheel. "I almost drove up here last spring, but Richard kept telling me you were doing great, busy, happy. I should have come anyway." "How did you find out?" I asked. He exhaled through his nose. "Dave Kessler. Drove past Birchwood in September. Saw Richard on a ladder painting shutters. Called me and asked why my son-in-law was living in the house I gave my granddaughter. That was it. That was the crack that started the collapse. From there, he had done what men like Grandpa always do. He gathered records, printed emails, tracked money, called his attorney, built the truth piece by piece until it could hold weight." "The question at dinner," I said. He glanced at me. "I suspected. But I needed to hear your answer in front of witnesses." That was Grandpa. He didn't guess when he could verify. He didn't explode when he could prove. He didn't attack. He documented. By the time we pulled into his driveway, I understood something. My father had inherited my grandfather's access, but not his integrity. By midnight, my father had called 7 times. Not once did he use the word sorry. Sat on Grandpa's plaid couch under an old quilt while my phone buzzed across the coffee table. The living room looked exactly the same as it had when I was a child. Wood paneling, carpentry books, a loud mantel clock, a lamp that always leaned slightly left, the kind of room that doesn't care about trends because it was built around use, not performance. The texts came one after another. "Grace, please let me explain. You don't understand the pressure I was under. Don't let Dad destroy this family." That one almost made me laugh. Destroy this family? As if he hadn't been swinging the hammer himself for years. At 10:30, Aunt Carolyn called. She and Dennis had left right after I did. "Ed and Dana were already gone," she said. Pamela threw a plate at the kitchen wall. Not at anyone, just the wall. Richard sat there for 20 minutes without moving. I could picture the shattered plate. Probably expensive. Probably bought with my money. Then, at 11:04, a final text arrived. This one from Pamela. "You always wanted attention. Congratulations, you got it." 5 words. And with those 5 words, every fake smile, every polished gesture, every years-long act of maternal warmth evaporated instantly. No confusion left. No ambiguity. Just the truth in its natural form. I showed the text to Grandpa. He read it, set my phone down, walked into the kitchen, and called his attorney from the old landline he refused to replace because, in his words, anything important ought to work without charging. I heard him leave a voicemail. "Margaret, it's Will Hartley. I need the demand letter drafted Monday morning. Deed recovery, full restitution, damages. I'll bring the file by 9. Then he came back, sat down across from me with 2 mugs of instant coffee, and said something I never forgot. "Your father isn't asking for forgiveness. He's asking you to stand between him and consequences." He was right. That was exactly what he wanted. And if I'm being honest, that's what he had wanted from me my entire life. Silence, compliance, emotional labor, the daughter who absorbs damage so the adults can keep functioning. But that version of me had just left the house on Christmas Eve, and she was not coming back. The attorney laid out the numbers the following Tuesday. There is something uniquely horrifying about hearing your betrayal itemized. Margaret Layton was 61, razor precise, and had the kind of calm voice that makes bad news sound even worse, because there's no drama left to hide inside. She put us on speaker. I stood in Grandpa's kitchen, gripping the edge of the counter. She read the spending like a ledger of theft, $180,000 to settle debt tied to Townsend Motor Works, $56,000 for 2 years of tuition at Ridgemont Academy, $42,000 in home renovations, kitchen, living room, garage expansion, $38,000 for the pearl white SUV registered in Pamela's name, $29,000 in travel, theme parks, beach trips, a lake house rental, and another $55,000 in assorted lifestyle purchases, decor, dining, furniture, holiday expenses, matching ornaments, napkin rings. Everything I had quietly noticed at that Christmas dinner suddenly had a receipt attached to it. Then came the detail that made it worse, because apparently there is always a worse. Since the deed had never been properly transferred to me, my father had used the Birchwood property as collateral to secure a second mortgage. $120,000. The house was now underwater, which meant the home that was supposed to protect my future had been leveraged, drained, and dragged toward foreclosure. I drank an entire glass of water without tasting it, then another. Margaret asked, "Grace, what outcome are you seeking?" I stared at the wall clock while it ticked through my life in small, indifferent seconds. And then I answered honestly, I want out. Not just money, not just repayment. Out. Out of that town. Out of that script. Out of that gravitational field where every version of my life somehow became fuel for theirs. Grandpa nodded once. Then let's build from there. Aunt Carolyn brought it back to me in a cardboard box 2 Saturdays later. I went over there yesterday, she said. This didn't belong to her. She set the box on the kitchen table, and inside was my mother's recipe box. Oak, smooth corners, the stubborn brass hinge, the tiny scratch across the lid where I had once dragged a butter knife as a child, and cried about it until my mother kissed my forehead and said, "Now it has character." I opened it with shaking hands. The index cards were all still there. Tomato sauce, apple pie, chicken soup, pot roast, blue ink in my mother's neat, right-slanting handwriting, and in the margins, small notes. Gracie likes extra cheese. Double this for Will. Don't let Richard near the pepper grinder. I laughed, then immediately cried. At the very bottom, tucked behind the divider cards, was something else. A note, folded once, same blue ink, same handwriting. On the front it said, "For Grace when you're old enough." Inside, only one short message. "The house on Birchwood was my grandmother's. I want you to have it someday. Asked Grandpa. He knows." That was it. No long speech, no sentimental paragraph. Just my mother's certainty, preserved on an index card and hidden in a recipe box that had somehow survived in the wrong kitchen. Grandpa read it after me, removed his glasses, cleaned them with his shirt, put them back on, then said, "When she got the diagnosis, she made me promise." Pamela had been using that box to hold grocery coupons, and somehow that hurt more than the money, because money is measurable. Money can be traced, demanded, recovered, but the casual desecration of someone's memory, the way certain people use sacred things as storage because they don't understand reverence, that kind of cruelty lives outside accounting. The first text from Bridget came at 11 o'clock on a school night, unknown number. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I was sitting on Grandpa's porch under 2 sweaters and my mother's cable knit, watching my breath ghost in the winter air. I stared at the message for a long moment, then replied, "Are you okay?" She answered immediately. "This is Bridget. I'm using Lily's phone. Mom told me not to talk to you." Of course she did. We texted for 20 minutes, maybe 30. Teenage honesty has a way of landing harder than adult confession because it doesn't know how to disguise itself yet. She told me my father was sleeping on the couch. Pamela cried at night but acted normal in the morning. Nobody answered her questions properly. When she asked about the money, Pamela told her to focus on school. Then came the message that broke my heart. Am I a bad person? I stared at it for a long time, not because the answer was difficult, because I wanted it to be exact. "No," I wrote back. "You are not a bad person. You didn't make this decision. They did, and I do not blame you for any of it." Then another message. "Mom says you're doing this for attention." I almost smiled. "That sounds like your mom." A pause. Then, "I miss you." Is that weird? No, that wasn't weird. That was probably the truest sentence either of us had heard from anyone in that house for years. "It's not weird," I wrote, "and nobody gets to tell you who you're allowed to love." We talked about books after that, and school, and whether pineapple belongs on pizza. Nothing heavy, because sometimes love doesn't arrive through dramatic reconciliation. Sometimes it arrives through small, normal conversations that quietly prove the relationship is still alive. She ended with a heart emoji. I sat on that porch a long time after the screen went dark, realizing that even in a family built on distortion, Something honest had still survived. Bridget and I had not chosen the same parents, but we had both inherited the same damage, and maybe that was enough to start from. The formal demand letter went out the first Monday in February. 4 pages, precise, merciless, and in my opinion, still kinder than my father deserved. Margaret demanded full restitution of $400,000 plus accrued interest, transfer of the Birchwood Lane deed free and clear, reimbursement of my 22 months of rent, $22,800, for housing I never should have needed had the property been transferred as intended. The letter cited conversion of assets, breach of fiduciary duty, fraudulent misrepresentation, and it attached copies of the email where my father explicitly told Grandpa everything had already been given to me. He responded within 3 days, not in writing at first, by phone, to Grandpa. I heard most of it through the kitchen wall. "Dad, please." Then silence. "We'll lose everything." Longer silence. "Pamela will leave me." Then Grandpa's voice, calm as granite. "You already lost everything, Richard. You lost it the day you sent that email." Another silence, then quieter. "I'm your son." And Grandpa answered, "She's Ellen's daughter." That line stayed with me because it wasn't just about blood, it was about duty. My father wanted the privileges of being someone's son without honoring the responsibilities of being someone's father, and those are not the same thing. The following week, Pamela hired her own attorney. Naturally, her position was that Richard had acted alone. She knew nothing, signed nothing knowingly, spent nothing under false pretenses, but the paperwork had other ideas. The SUV was in her name. The renovation invoices were addressed to her. The school checks carried her signature. Turns out when you spend stolen money long enough, you accidentally create your own evidence trail. She tried to throw my father under the bus. My father was already under several. It did not help. I packed my entire life into 6 cardboard boxes. That was all I owned that mattered. Clothes, books, a kettle, my mother's sweater, the birthday card from Grandpa, and the recipe box. The insurance office gave me a good reference and a card signed by everyone. My landlord kept the security deposit because of a coffee stain I had been strategically ignoring for months. Fair enough. Some losses are small enough to release without grief. Grandpa offered me a 2-bedroom unit in Brookfield, outside Chicago, one of his rental properties. No rent until I got steady. He also knew a man in residential construction looking for an office manager. "Good people," he said. "They'll hire you if you show up on time and don't make excuses." Then he looked at me over his coffee mug. "You've never made an excuse in your life." I hesitated. Because when you grow up half unwanted, receiving help can feel dangerously close to owing. "Grandpa," I said, "I don't want to become someone who just takes things." He set his mug down gently. "Grace, this isn't charity. This is family. The real kind. The kind that shows up." That sentence healed something in me. Not all at once, but enough. On the morning I left, Aunt Carolyn helped me load the car. She carried the last box, the one with the recipe box, and placed it in the passenger seat like it contained something holy. Then she touched my face and said, "Your mother would be so proud of you." I started crying immediately. She smiled through it and added, "Not because you're leaving, because you finally know you're allowed to." I drove out of town at 6:15 in the morning. The highway stretched open and flat and gray in front of me, like the beginning of a sentence I had not heard before. I checked the rearview mirror exactly once. Then I kept driving. 6 months later, I had a new city, a new routine, and the same old recipe box sitting on my kitchen counter. The Brookfield apartment wasn't glamorous. 2 bedrooms, if you were feeling generous. A small kitchen with barely enough counter space to roll dough unless you turned the cutting board diagonally. A bathroom window that stuck in humid weather. Secondhand table. Mismatched chairs. But every inch of it felt honest. I painted my bedroom pale blue on the first weekend, hung a photo of my mother in the kitchen, and found work within 3 weeks. Office manager at a residential construction company. Grandpa's introduction opened the door. My work kept me there. By month 2, my boss told me I was the most organized employee he'd ever hired. I said, "That's because I've spent most of my life organizing around other people's chaos." He laughed, thought I was joking. Every Thursday, Grandpa came for dinner. I'd cook one recipe from the box: chicken soup, pot roast, apple pie, tomato sauce. Always tomato sauce eventually. He'd sit at my uneven kitchen table and say, "Smells like Ellen's kitchen." And I'd say, "That's the point." Over time, I started adding my own cards to the box. Same type of lined index cards. My handwriting beside hers. Grace's chili next to Ellen's tomato sauce. A small thing, maybe. But healing often looks like continuing what should have been interrupted. Bridget kept texting. Mostly on Thursdays. She'd send pictures from school. A talent show. A book she liked. A terrible cafeteria lunch. Sometimes we talked about serious things. Mostly we didn't. Mostly we just practiced being sisters in the only honest way available to us. Quietly. Without permission. Without adults scripting it. And little by little, I stopped thinking thinking of myself as the abandoned daughter of a collapsing family. I started thinking of myself as a woman building a smaller, truer life, one she actually fit inside. The call came on a Tuesday in September. That felt fitting somehow. My father had a talent for turning ordinary weekdays into wreckage. I was drying a cast iron skillet when my phone lit up. His number. I let it ring twice before answering. "Grace," he said. "It's Dad. I know who it is." He took a breath that sounded thin and frayed. "I need your help." And right there in that first sentence, I understood something. He still hadn't called to repair anything. He had called because he needed a tool. He explained it in fragments. The Birchwood property was in foreclosure. The bank was moving on the second mortgage. Pamela had moved out in June and taken Bridget. They were living somewhere else now. He was alone in the renovated house, the one my money had helped create, waiting for it all to collapse in slow motion. "I know I messed up," he said. I leaned against the counter and looked out at the window ledge where a sparrow had landed. "You didn't mess up, Dad," I said quietly. "You made a choice. Then you made it again and again. That's not a mistake. That's a pattern." Silence. Then the sentence I knew was coming. "Can you talk to your grandfather? Ask him to drop the case?" There it was. Not apology, not responsibility, not concern for me, a request for rescue. I closed my eyes, and for a second, I saw every version of myself that had spent years being reasonable so other people didn't have to be good. Then I answered. "No." He inhaled sharply. "No, I'm not asking Grandpa to drop anything, and I'm not sending money." He started to speak. I kept going. "Not because I hate you, because I'm done being the person in this family who loses so everyone else can win." I let that sit. "That's my boundary, Dad. You can understand it or not. Either way, it stays." Then I hung up. My hand shook only a little. I set the phone down, picked up the skillet, finished drying it. Outside, the sparrow came back and stayed longer this time. The next Christmas Eve, I cooked dinner for 5 people in a kitchen half the size of the one I grew up in. And it was the best Christmas dinner of my life. The tomato sauce had been simmering since noon. Garlic, basil, onions softening slowly. The apartment smelled the way childhood should have smelled all along. Warm, layered, lived in. The recipe card was propped beside the stove, my mother's handwriting facing me like she was supervising from just outside the frame. Grandpa arrived first, as always. He sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and the newspaper, rereading the same article twice because that's what he did when he was content. "Smells like Ellen's kitchen," he said. "That's still the point," I answered. Carolyn and Dennis came at 5 with a pie and a bottle of wine, and the kind of warmth that genuinely changes a room when it enters. And then, a little later, the buzzer rang again. I opened the building door, and there stood Bridget, 15 now, hair cut short, her choice, not Pamela's, a backpack over one shoulder, nervous smile. She looked exactly like someone standing in a doorway hoping the person on the other side would be glad to see her. "Mom said I could come," she said. "First time she's let me." I pulled her into a hug before she finished the sentence. She hugged me tightly, quickly, the way people hug when they're trying to memorize safety before it disappears. We sat down, 5 people, one small table, mismatched chairs, paper napkins, no gold-rimmed china, no crystal, no showroom tree, no performance, just people who had chosen to be there. That was the difference. A year earlier, I had sat at the far end of my father's perfect dining table, wondering what I had done wrong. Now I sat at the head of my own imperfect one, understanding something much more important. Belonging is not created by wealth, or symmetry, or matching ornaments. It's created by choice, by honesty, by who tells the truth when it becomes expensive. We ate, we laughed. Grandpa told the same story twice about a contractor who once cut a beam too short and tried to blame the tape measure. Dennis laughed so hard he had to put his fork down. Carolyn cried at dessert for no reason other than relief. Bridget helped me wash dishes afterward. And at one point, she looked around my tiny kitchen and said, almost like she was surprised by her own words, "It feels peaceful here." I smiled and handed her a dish towel. "Yeah," I said. "That's because nobody's pretending. People always want the ending to be justice. A perfect legal win, a dramatic repayment, a final apology that lands with cinematic precision. Life usually does not work that way." The Birchwood property stayed tangled in foreclosure for a long time. My father still owed money he would probably never fully repay. Pamela, as far as I know, continued doing what people like Pamela always do, retelling events in whatever way protected her self-image best. Maybe in her version, she was unaware, maybe pressured, maybe misunderstood. People who live by performance usually perform even when nobody's clapping. And me? I did not get a clean ending. I got something better. I got clarity. I got distance. I got the ability to stop explaining away harm just because it came from family. I got a kitchen where my mother's handwriting still mattered. I got a grandfather who kept his promise, even late. I got an aunt who carried sacred things home in cardboard boxes. I got a sister who chose truth over instruction. And I got a table, a small table, an uneven table, a table with paper napkins and secondhand chairs, and not enough room for grand gestures. But every single person sitting at it wanted to be there. No one had to fake the photos. No one had to invent closeness. No one had to steal from one person to comfort another. That table taught me something I wish I had learned much younger. A beautiful room means nothing if the love inside it is counterfeit. And a humble room means everything if the people inside it are real. So no, I didn't get justice. Not in the clean, satisfying way stories like to promise. But I got my life back. And sometimes that is the greater victory. Because justice can depend on courts, paperwork, timing, and outcomes you don't fully control. But getting your life back? That begins the moment you stop volunteering to be the sacrifice. Part 28, Final Closing. If you've ever had to draw a line with your own family, if you've ever discovered that the people closest to you were comfortable benefiting from your silence, if you've ever sat at a table and realized you were the only one there telling the truth, I want you to hear this. You are not cruel for setting boundaries. You are not selfish for protecting what's yours. And you are not obligated to stay in rooms where your pain is constantly being renamed overreaction. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is leave the perfect-looking table and build a smaller, truer one of your own. That Christmas, my grandfather asked one question, just one, and it exposed years of lies. But the real miracle wasn't the exposure. It was what came after. Because after the lies collapsed, I finally had room to build something honest. And that, it turns out, was the inheritance they could never steal.